I still remember that Thanksgiving like it was yesterday. The smell of roasted turkey filled the house, mingling with the faint scent of pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. The dining room was warm and bright, the kind of warm you feel in your chest as much as on your skin. I had spent most of the morning cooking, carving, setting the table just the way my mother used to do it, down to the folded napkins and polished silverware. I had wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted the kind of day we all imagined when we were kids, the day where family laughs, shares stories, and just exists together. I walked into the dining room carrying the last tray of food. My daughter, Emma, was already there, sitting at the head of the table, scrolling through her phone. She was 17 then, tall for her age, and in those years where you can see the woman she's becoming but still feel the little girl she used to be when she used to fall asleep on my chest after a rough day. I remember thinking, this is it. This is our family, sitting together like we always dreamed. I tried to start a conversation, like I always do during the holidays. I wanted laughter. I wanted stories. I started talking about something light, my own childhood memories, the way my father used to sneak extra desserts when no one was looking. I laughed at myself mid-story, hoping to spark a chuckle from everyone. My wife smiled faintly. The younger kids were distracted, but Emma, she wasn't listening. She didn't even look up. Her thumb flicked across the screen with a kind of practiced impatience. I paused for a second, and that little pause, that moment where a father notices something slipping away, made my chest tighten. I tried again. I said, Emma, remember last year when? And then she said it. Shut up, Dad. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a passing annoyance. It was loud enough to freeze my heart mid-beat. The words hung in the air, and suddenly, I felt every Thanksgiving I had ever known crash down around me. I froze, holding the tray of mashed potatoes like it had become too heavy to carry. The laughter in the room stuttered and died, replaced by a quiet so sharp it cut into me. Excuse me, I said, my voice trembling without me even realizing it. She rolled her eyes, didn't budge, didn't even glance up. I said, shut up, Dad. Just stop talking. I felt a kind of numb disbelief that I hadn't felt before. I looked at my wife, who avoided my gaze. She was trying not to react, probably thinking I should just let it go. But letting it go? Letting this slip? I couldn't. That little girl I had held in my arms, that little person who once begged me to tell her stories at night, had suddenly become a stranger with sharp edges. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. Emma, I said softly, that's not how we talk to each other. Not in this house. Not on Thanksgiving. Her response was a scoff, followed by, whatever, Dad. You're embarrassing me. And that was it. That was the moment. A single sentence that fractured something in me I didn't even know was so fragile. I had never been shouted at by my children before. I had never felt that mix of confusion, hurt, and shame all at once. I felt my face burn, my hands shake, and for the first time in years, I wanted to disappear, to be somewhere else entirely. I set the tray down gently. I didn't throw it. I didn't slam it. I just set it down. Because I didn't want her to see the tears threatening to spill. Because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had wounded me so deeply. I just sat back in my chair, silent, staring at her face, trying to reconcile the girl I knew with the woman she seemed to be trying to become overnight. The room felt colder after that. Conversation stumbled. My wife tried to steer the moment back to dinner, to the turkey, to the mashed potatoes I had worked so hard on. The younger kids, sensing the tension, exchanged worried glances, but said nothing. And Emma? She went back to scrolling on her phone, as if she hadn't just spoken to me with words meant to cut. I couldn't eat. I couldn't speak. I felt a quiet panic, the kind that creeps up slowly, making your chest tight and your thoughts scatter. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. How did we get here? How did my little girl turn into someone who could look at me like that? I remembered all the times I had tried to be there for her. The nights I stayed up helping with homework she didn't want to do. The mornings I woke up early to make her breakfast, pack her lunch, and remind her she could do anything. The weekends spent coaching her soccer team, driving her to music lessons, attending every recital, every parent-teacher conference. All the sacrifices, all the effort, all the love, and this was what it came to. I wanted to shout back, to demand respect, to tell her exactly how wrong she was. But instead, I just sat there. I let the hurt settle deep inside me. It was like a slow-burning fire, something that wouldn't flare up into anger, but would linger quietly, painfully, making me question myself and my place in my own home. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my wife finally spoke. "Let's just eat," she said, her voice low, strained, almost apologetic. I nodded silently. I didn't argue. I couldn't. The energy had left me. All I could do was move through the motions, pass the gravy, pour the cranberry sauce, smile faintly at a joke that barely reached me. And through it all, Emma didn't look at me once. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't acknowledge the silence, the tension, the moment we had just shared. She sat there, aloof, confident, untouchable. I remember thinking, is this what growing up is? Because it didn't feel like it. It felt like losing. Losing someone you once knew, losing a part of yourself you didn't even know was dependent on their love and respect. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the living room, the dishes still unwashed, the table still set. I stared at the empty chairs, at the remnants of the meal, at the faint smell of pie lingering in the air. And I cried. Not loudly, not in anger. Quietly, gently, like a man who had finally realized that the life he had built, the family he had nurtured, was no longer the same. I cried for the daughter I had known, for the father I wanted to be, and for the distance that now stretched between us. And somewhere deep inside me, something shifted. I didn't know it then, not fully. But the next day, and the days after that, I began to notice small things, how she spoke to me, how she dismissed my opinions, how she seemed to take for granted the stability I had tried to provide. And that little spark that had ignited in me that night, quiet, gentle, almost imperceptible, grew into something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was awareness. And it would eventually change everything about how I looked at my family, at myself, and at the choices I had to make to protect what little dignity I had left. But that night, it was just me, the empty house, and the echo of a single sentence that would haunt me for months. "Shut up, Dad." I didn't know it then, but that word, that simple string of letters, would mark the beginning of a journey that would test my patience, my heart, and my very understanding of what it meant to be a father. And it all started with a Thanksgiving, a turkey, and a daughter who didn't realize the weight of the words she had just spoken. I want to take a step back from that Thanksgiving, from the words my daughter spoke that night, and show you who we were, who I was, before the fracture. Because that night didn't happen in a vacuum. It came at the end of years of love, of hard work, of hope, and yes, of quiet frustration. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, a place where everybody knew everybody else's business, and your reputation often meant more than your bank account. My father was a quiet man, the kind who showed love in small ways. A cup of coffee waiting for me in the morning, a pat on the shoulder, a smile that only came when no one else was looking. My mother was the opposite, loud, affectionate, full of energy and ideas, always busy planning the next family event, the next dinner, the next holiday. I inherited a little of both, I think. I inherited the quiet patience from my father and the desire to make people feel seen from my mother. When I met my wife, Linda, it felt like the pieces of my life were finally aligning. She was kind, grounded, and had a laugh that made even the worst days seem lighter. We married young, at 24, because it felt right. We didn't have much, an old apartment in the city, a second-hand car, nothing fancy, but we had each other. And over time, that became enough. We built a life together with the kind of quiet determination that comes from knowing you can rely on each other. Our first child, Emma, arrived 3 years later. I remember holding her in the hospital, marveling at the tiny hands, the fragile skin, the little yawn that seemed bigger than the whole world. In that moment, I swore I would do everything I could to make her life better than mine. I wanted her to feel loved, safe, and confident, to grow up knowing that she was never alone. That was my promise. The years that followed were full, messy, beautiful, and exhausting. We had 3 more children after Emma, each one different, each one a new challenge. Alex, our second, was quiet like me but had this sharp intelligence that left you in awe. Lily, our third, was fiery, stubborn, and full of energy. And finally, little Ben, the youngest, who seemed to smile even when the world around him was gray. Raising 4 kids wasn't easy. I worked long hours in construction, coming home tired, aching in places I didn't know could hurt. Linda worked part-time at the local school, But even when she was home, she seemed busier than anyone else. Between homework, school activities, soccer practice, music lessons, and doctor appointments, our lives felt like a constant rush. And yet, despite the exhaustion, we made it work. We celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes, decorated Christmas trees with 100 lights, and never missed a chance to tell the kids we loved them. But life, as it tends to do, was never just the good parts. The stress of bills, work, and daily responsibilities began to show in small ways. I remember the nights I'd sit in the living room, rubbing my aching back, staring at the ceiling, and thinking about how I could make everything better. I wanted to give them everything: education, comfort, opportunities, but money was always tight. Every month was a balancing act. I learned to stretch every paycheck, to cut corners without sacrificing the kids' happiness. It worked most of the time. Emma, though, was different. She was sensitive, intelligent, and stubborn. She had this quiet fire that I admired, but as she grew older, that fire sometimes became a storm. I remember the first time I realized she could push back in ways I hadn't anticipated. She was 12, and I had tried to enforce bedtime rules. She had stomped her feet, crossed her arms, and said, "You're not the boss of me." I had laughed it off then, assuming it was just a phase. But looking back, I see it as the first crack. As the years passed, those cracks became more noticeable. Emma was smart, yes, but she also had opinions about everything. Our parenting, our household, our choices. And she wasn't shy about sharing them. She would question rules, challenge decisions, and sometimes, without realizing it, wound me deeply with her words. I tried to remind myself that this was part of growing up, that rebellion was natural. But each word, each dismissive glance, added to a quiet weight on my chest. Despite all this, we had moments of joy that I will never forget. Family trips, camping in the woods, movie nights on the couch with popcorn scattered across the floor, and those rare mornings when everyone slept in and we could just sit together in silence, drinking coffee and enjoying the simple fact of being a family. These moments were small but precious, and I clung to them. Linda was the glue. She often mediated between me and the kids, smoothing over conflicts, softening words before they became wounds. She had a way of seeing the best in everyone, of finding compromise where I saw only battle. I loved her for it, even when I sometimes felt like I wasn't enough, like I was failing somehow. Our household was filled with routines that most people would take for granted. Breakfast at 7, kids off to school by 8, work until 5 or 6, homework, dinner, bedtime. Weekends were for errands, soccer games, or catching up on chores we couldn't handle during the week. Vacations were rare, but we made the most of them. Even the little things, baking cookies together, watching the snow fall outside, reading bedtime stories, were reminders of why we worked so hard. But the thing about routines is that they can also hide cracks. They can lull you into a sense of security while the tension grows beneath the surface. And in our house, there was tension, quiet, simmering, and often invisible until it erupted. It wasn't always obvious, but it was there. Money worries, school struggles, sibling arguments, small disagreements that escalated, they all piled up, quietly shaping our family dynamic. I also have to admit something difficult. I struggled to assert myself. I wanted to be the calm, patient father, the one who didn't yell, didn't lose his temper, didn't let anger take over. I thought this was strength. But looking back, I see it sometimes left me feeling invisible, unheard, and ultimately disconnected. My opinions, my feelings, and my boundaries were often sacrificed for peace. I wanted harmony, yes, but maybe I gave too much of myself in the process. Emma, particularly, began to sense this. She noticed the way I avoided conflict, the way I swallowed my frustration, the way I smiled even when I was hurt. And teenagers are sharp. They can see vulnerability a mile away. I think she felt, on some level, that she could push limits, test boundaries, and get away with more than she should have. And again, I tried to be patient. I tried to guide her. But patience can only stretch so far before it snaps, or at least begins to fray. As the years went on, I watched my children grow into their own personalities. Alex became a perfectionist, Lily stubborn and fiery, Ben gentle and funny. Emma became a force of nature. Smart, independent, confident, and sometimes brutally honest. She had a sharp tongue, a keen mind, and an independence that made me proud and scared all at once. She could charm a room with a smile, and she could cut through a conversation with a single sarcastic remark. It was like living with someone 10 steps ahead of you at all times. And I loved her, of course. I always loved her. But love doesn't make boundaries irrelevant. Love doesn't erase the need for respect. And sometimes, it doesn't protect you from pain. We were a family like any other, with love and chaos intertwined. We shared meals, stories, laughter, and tears. We celebrated birthdays, holidays, small victories, and even small failures. But beneath it all, there was a quiet tension, a sense of things unsaid, feelings unexpressed, emotions deferred. And in hindsight, I see that these moments of silence, these small unspoken words, were seeds. Seeds that would eventually grow into the conflict that came crashing down one Thanksgiving night. That's what I want you to understand about us. Before the words "shut up" shattered my heart, we were a family full of love and chaos, routine and rebellion, laughter and tension. We were human, flawed, imperfect, trying our best, often falling short, but always striving to hold on to each other. And yet, no matter how much love existed in that house, the foundation was beginning to crack. The first cracks were subtle. Emma's growing independence, my quiet compromises, the way small arguments were left unresolved. All of it contributed. I didn't know it then. I couldn't see it. I thought we were fine. I thought love alone could hold everything together. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes, love needs structure. Sometimes, love needs boundaries. And sometimes, love needs courage. The courage to say no, the courage to stand firm, and the courage to protect your dignity when it is challenged. That Thanksgiving, when Emma told me to shut up, I felt the weight of all those unspoken moments, all those cracks, all those compromises come crashing down at once. I realized, painfully, that I had ignored the warning signs for years. I had allowed a slow drift to occur between us, a drift that I could no longer deny, no matter how hard I tried. And in that moment, I began to see clearly. I began to understand the work I had failed to do, the boundaries I had neglected, the respect I had taken for granted. I began to understand that the rest of our story, the fight, the fall, the realization, would all stem from this moment, from this single fracture in the relationship I cherished most. I didn't know it then. I could only sit there, silent, broken, staring at my daughter, trying to reconcile the girl I raised with the woman she was becoming. And yet, somewhere inside me, a quiet determination was beginning to form. Because if love alone couldn't fix this, then something else had to. It didn't happen overnight, of course. No one argument or one incident could explain the slow erosion of the respect that had once existed between Emma and me. It was years in the making, like water slowly carving a canyon into stone. And when it finally erupted, it did so with a force I had not been prepared for. It started with small things, little dismissals, comments meant to sting but disguised as jokes, small rebellions that seemed innocent to the outside eye but felt like daggers to me. I remember one evening clearly. It was late October, just weeks before that Thanksgiving that changed everything. I had asked Emma to help her younger sister, Lily, with homework. Lily had been struggling with her math, and I had hoped Emma, who excelled in the subject, could help her without complaint. "Dad, I don't have time," Emma said, not even looking up from her phone. "I have better things to do." I paused, trying to catch my breath, trying not to react too sharply. I had learned over the years that losing my temper rarely helped. "Emma," I said carefully, "helping your sister doesn't take that long. And it's the right thing to do." She rolled her eyes, her sigh loud enough to fill the small living room. "You're always telling me what's right. I don't need this lecture. Just leave me alone." Her words hit me harder than she could have imagined. I wanted to shout. I wanted to scold. But instead, I tried the patient approach. "Emma, I'm asking you as your father. Please, help her." She huffed, got up, and stomped to her room, slamming the door behind her. Lily looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Dad, she won't listen," she whispered. That was when I realized the problem was bigger than I thought. Emma's defiance wasn't just a phase, it was becoming a pattern. She wasn't listening because she didn't want to, not because she was distracted or busy. And I couldn't just ignore it, not if I wanted her to grow into a respectful, responsible adult. Arguments like this became more frequent. Dinner conversations turned into tense exchanges. I found myself walking on eggshells, careful with every word, trying not to spark another conflict. My wife, Linda, would often intervene, softening the tension, reminding me to let things slide for the sake of peace. And I tried. I really did. But peace at the cost of respect was a heavy price to pay. One evening, it reached a new level. I had spent the entire day at work, my body aching, my mind racing with worry about bills and schedules. I came home to find Emma in the living room, blasting music so loud it made my head throb. I asked her to turn it down. Why? So you can lecture me again? She snapped, glaring at me. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Emma, I'm asking you nicely. Turn it down. She laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. Or what, Dad? You'll make me. It was the way she said it. The look in her eyes, the complete disregard for authority, for respect, for the effort I put into our home and family. That broke something in me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell. I wanted to remind her that I had spent years providing, protecting, and loving her, and this was the thanks I got. But I stayed silent. I walked to my chair, sat down, and tried to breathe through the anger that threatened to consume me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the exchange over and over in my mind. I asked myself the same questions I had asked countless times before. Am I failing as a father? Am I too lenient? Am I letting her get away with behavior that will only hurt her later? And the truth was clear. I was failing. Not because I wasn't trying, not because I didn't love her, but because I had allowed respect to erode slowly, piece by piece, without addressing it directly. I had hoped patience and love would be enough, but they weren't. Not when faced with defiance masked as independence. The fights escalated over time. They were never physical, never violent, but the emotional weight was crushing. Every word, every tone, every glance carried tension. I remember another incident vividly. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had promised to take the kids to the park, a rare break from our busy schedules. I asked Emma to get ready, to bring her jacket and shoes. 10 minutes passed. 20. 30. She didn't come down. I went upstairs, knocking gently on her door. Emma, are you ready? Not now, she shouted. I opened the door to find her sitting on the floor, scrolling on her phone. You promised to come, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Whatever, Dad, she said, barely looking up. Go without me. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. It was more than anger. It was hurt, disbelief, and a sense of betrayal. This was my daughter, my little girl who used to run into my arms when she was scared, telling me she didn't want me around. I walked back downstairs, defeated. The younger kids were ready, and my wife looked at me with that familiar, apologetic expression. She whispered, "Don't let it get to you. She's just being a teenager." But I couldn't let it go. I knew this wasn't just about a day at the park. This was about respect, about boundaries, about the gradual erosion of the relationship I had worked so hard to nurture. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that this pattern wouldn't end on its own. I tried different approaches. I tried talking to her calmly, explaining why her behavior was hurtful. I tried giving her space, hoping that independence would teach her lessons without confrontation. I even tried stricter consequences, grounding her for a week, restricting privileges. Each time, the pushback was stronger, sharper, more defiant. She seemed determined to assert herself at any cost, and every time, I felt a little more powerless. The tension began to affect the entire family. Sibling fights escalated because Emma refused to follow rules she thought didn't apply to her. Dinner conversations became exercises in diplomacy. Even the youngest, Ben, started noticing the friction, asking questions I couldn't fully answer. "Why does Emma always yell at you, Dad?" he asked one evening, his small voice trembling. I hugged him tightly, trying to shield him from the growing storm, but I knew he was already seeing it. Work didn't help either. I was exhausted physically and mentally, and by the time I got home, I barely had energy to engage in the ongoing battles at home. I remember one particular night, coming home after a 12-hour shift, hoping for a quiet dinner. Instead, I found Emma arguing with her mother over homework, the volume rising until it was impossible to ignore. "Emma, that's enough," I shouted, my patience finally snapping. She turned to me, eyes blazing, and said, "You don't tell me what to do anymore, Dad. I'm done listening." The words hit me like a punch. Done listening? Done respecting me? It was as if the years of care, the nights I stayed up sick with worry, The days I spent working my hands to the bone meant nothing. I wanted to collapse in frustration and grief. Instead, I stayed standing, silent, letting the words sink in, feeling the weight of failure press down on my chest. And then came the whispers, the small betrayals that cut deeper than words ever could. Friends and neighbors began noticing the tension. I overheard Emma telling her friends that I was controlling, old-fashioned, out of touch. She painted a picture of me that didn't exist, of a father who didn't care, who didn't love, who was only there to enforce rules. I felt my heart break a little more each time I heard it. I tried to remind myself that teenagers exaggerate, that they push boundaries to test limits. But there were moments when her words weren't exaggerations, they were deliberate. She spoke with precision, knowing exactly what to say to wound, to provoke, to assert dominance. And I realized, with growing fear, that the pattern wasn't going to stop. I began to withdraw emotionally, quietly protecting myself from the daily bruises. I still provided, still showed love, still tried to guide her, but a part of me retreated. I couldn't risk being shredded emotionally every day. I began keeping my thoughts and feelings to myself, sharing less, revealing less, retreating into silence. It was a lonely, painful existence, even in a house full of people. I watched the distance grow between us, the subtle shifts in her behavior, the way respect was replaced by defiance. And I knew, deep down, I had reached a point where something had to change. Because if I continued like this, if I continued letting the disrespect slide, I would lose more than just authority. I would lose my dignity, my sense of self, and perhaps even the connection I had once cherished with my daughter. It was around this time, in those dark, quiet moments, that I began thinking about money, not in a selfish sense, but as a means of protection. For years, I had allowed joint finances, shared accounts, and unrestricted access to funds for the sake of convenience, trust, and family unity. But now, I saw that trust being taken for granted, that unity being challenged by disrespect. I began to wonder, could controlling my own finances, setting boundaries around money, help restore some order, some respect, some sense of self in a house where my authority had been slowly eroded? I didn't know the answer yet. I only knew that something had to change, that the old way, patient, silent, accommodating, was no longer enough. The conflict had reached a tipping point, and the next step would define not only my relationship with Emma, but the entire dynamic of our family. After months of conflict, after countless arguments and silent tensions, I started noticing something I hadn't anticipated, the loneliness. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being physically alone, but the kind that creeps in when you feel unseen in your own home, surrounded by people, yet profoundly disconnected. That's what it felt like. Every word I spoke was met with indifference, every gesture ignored, every attempt at guidance dismissed. I remember sitting in the living room one evening, long after the younger kids had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I had cooked dinner for everyone, served it with a smile, and watched as Emma barely touched her plate, scrolling on her phone, while Alex and Lily whispered to each other, hesitant to speak up, and Ben quietly picked at his food. I felt like an outsider, not a father, not a husband, just a man occupying space in his own home. The more I tried to connect, the more I felt a wall rising between us. It wasn't just Emma, it was the ripple effect of her defiance, the tension it created in the household. My wife, Linda, tried her best to mediate, to soften the blows, to keep the peace. But even she couldn't erase the distance. There were moments when I caught her glancing at me with a mix of sympathy and worry, moments when her hand brushed mine on the counter, and I realized she felt it too. The silent erosion of intimacy and connection. I started withdrawing in small ways. I spent more evenings in the garage, tinkering with old projects, pretending the smell of sawdust and motor oil was enough to fill the emptiness inside. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, arguments, moments of rejection. The words "shut up, Dad" echoed endlessly, a haunting refrain I couldn't escape. Sleep became irregular. Some nights, I would drift off briefly, only to wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, mind racing with everything I hadn't said, everything I should have done differently. I questioned myself constantly. Was I too lenient? Too strict? Did I fail to guide her properly? Did I give her too much freedom, or not enough? The answers were never clear, only shifting shadows that left me exhausted and hollow. Even my work suffered. On the surface, I was fine, punctual, competent, diligent, but inside, I was distracted, preoccupied. I would sometimes forget small tasks, misplace tools, or lose track of deadlines. I would find myself staring at walls, replaying the latest confrontation with Emma, wondering if I could have said something differently, if I could have prevented it. My coworkers noticed. A few asked if I was okay, and I would smile politely and assure them I was fine, while inside, the storm raged on. The emotional toll seeped into my relationship with my wife. We had always shared responsibilities, decisions, and burdens equally, or at least tried to. But now, I found myself holding back. I didn't want to burden her with the weight of my pain, didn't want to add another layer of stress to the household she was already managing. So I smiled, nodded, did my share of chores, and pretended that everything was normal. But inside, I felt fractured, like a cracked vase holding water too heavy for its delicate structure. The children noticed. Alex, who had always been thoughtful, began asking questions that revealed his awareness of the tension. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked one night, his voice small and uncertain. I hugged him, telling him I was fine, but the truth was I wasn't. Lily, fiery and outspoken, would sometimes snap at Emma in a way that mirrored the conflicts she had seen at home, and I knew it was my failure that had shaped those dynamics. Even little Ben, who used to laugh at everything, started hesitating, watching the adults around him with quiet concern. I felt a profound sense of failure, not just as a father, but as a man trying to hold his family together. Every choice I had made, every sacrifice, every ounce of patience seemed inadequate. I began questioning everything: my parenting, my marriage, my own self-worth. It was a slow, grinding realization, like sandpaper against raw skin, wearing away the confidence I had once carried. And then came the moments of isolation that were almost unbearable. One evening, after yet another argument with Emma over school responsibilities, I retreated to the garage. The smell of sawdust, the soft hum of the old fluorescent light, and the faint echo of my own breathing became my only companions. I sat there for hours, staring at projects I had started but never finished, wondering if any of the effort I had poured into this family, mattered. I realized I had become invisible in my own home. Not because they didn't see me, but because I allowed myself to be invisible. I had silenced my own needs, my own emotions, in favor of avoiding conflict. And in doing so, I had created a vacuum, a space where my authority and dignity had been quietly eroded. The turning point, though subtle, began to reveal itself in the quietest moments. I noticed small things: how Emma spoke to her friends about me behind my back, how she dismissed my advice in public, how her tone with me had shifted from playful defiance to calculated disrespect. I began to realize that love and patience, while important, were not enough on their own. There needed to be boundaries. There needed to be consequences. There needed to be respect, and respect required assertion. I started keeping a journal, a private record of the incidents, arguments, and patterns I observed. At first, it was just to vent, to release some of the bottled-up frustration. But over time, I noticed a pattern emerging. I could see the slow accumulation of disrespect, the erosion of trust, and the ways in which my own avoidance had contributed to the problem. It was painful, almost unbearable, but also enlightening. Isolation became both my punishment and my teacher. In the quiet of the house, after the younger kids were asleep and the chaos of the day had settled, I confronted the reality I had been avoiding. I admitted to myself that I had allowed boundaries to be crossed, that I had tolerated behavior that should never have been accepted. I realized that I needed to make a choice, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. The emotional weight was compounded by financial stress. I had always been careful with money, meticulous about bills, savings, and future plans. But I began to notice how the shared accounts and easy access had allowed certain attitudes to flourish. Emma, though not yet an adult, had begun to test the limits of what she could take, what she could demand, and what she could manipulate. I realized that if I didn't assert some control, the erosion of respect wouldn't stop at words. It could extend into the way resources were shared, decisions were made, and boundaries were enforced. I started withdrawing into quiet reflection, considering my options. It wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming dignity, about creating a framework where respect was non-negotiable, about ensuring that the love I had poured into my family over decades wasn't taken for granted. I began to research, talk to trusted friends, even reflect on my own upbringing and the lessons I had learned from my father. But the emotional fall continued. I felt the loneliness keenly. I longed for connection, for acknowledgement, for a sense that my efforts mattered. I felt the sting of rejection not just from Emma, but from the cumulative tension that had affected every member of the household. The younger children, in their own ways, mirrored the strain. Even Linda, who had always been my anchor, was affected, navigating the delicate balance between supporting me and protecting herself from the emotional turmoil. I realized, painfully, that the emotional fall wasn't something I could escape. It was part of the journey, a necessary descent into awareness, reflection, and eventual change. I had to face the consequences of years of avoidance, silence, and compromise. I had to confront the reality that love alone, without boundaries or assertiveness, could not sustain a family under strain. And so I sat in my garage, in the quiet of the night, writing, reflecting, and planning. I acknowledged my failures, my regrets, and my fears. I grieved the distance that had grown between me and my daughter, the respect that had been lost, and the emotional isolation I now endured. I accepted the pain, understanding that it was a teacher, a guide, and a warning. I also began to see the seeds of change. The recognition that I needed to act, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of love, dignity, and necessity, was the first spark of hope. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that confrontation and assertion would be uncomfortable, and that not everyone would understand my decisions. But I also knew that in order to preserve my own self-respect and, ultimately, the integrity of the family, I had no choice. The fall was deep, painful, and isolating. But it was not the end. It was a beginning, a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, a turning point where reflection and awareness would lead to action, and where the painful lessons of neglect, silence, and compromise would shape the next chapter of our story. In those long nights, in the quiet of an empty house, I understood something fundamental, that love without boundaries is fragile, that patience without respect is unsustainable, and that sometimes the greatest act of care is the courage to enforce limits, even when it hurts, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it risks conflict. I think realization often comes quietly, like a slow sunrise breaking through a long, dark night. It doesn't scream. It doesn't announce itself. It simply unfolds, and when it does, you can't unsee it. For me, that moment came gradually, after months of arguments, isolation, and the steady erosion of my confidence and respect in my own home. It began with reflection. Those long nights in the garage, sitting among half-finished projects and the faint smell of sawdust, were no longer just about escape. They became a mirror. I started asking myself questions I had avoided for years. Why am I here? What am I allowing? What is this family without respect, boundaries, or recognition? The answers weren't easy. They were uncomfortable, even painful, but they were necessary. I realized that love and patience, while noble, were insufficient on their own. They were like holding a fragile vase together with glue. It might appear intact, but the cracks underneath grow with time, threatening to shatter everything. I had given everything, my time, my energy, my attention, yet I had neglected myself. I had allowed disrespect to fester, unchallenged. I had compromised my dignity for the sake of peace, and in doing so, I had lost something vital. I remember the exact moment I decided something had to change. It wasn't dramatic, not a single confrontation or shout. It was a quiet night, sitting alone after dinner, the house still, the children in bed, my wife cleaning up in the kitchen. I thought about Emma, about her words, her disregard, her casual dismissal of everything I had built, and I felt a strange clarity wash over me. I realized that I could no longer continue in silence. I could no longer hope that things would improve on their own. I needed to assert myself, not angrily, not vengefully, but firmly, deliberately. I needed boundaries, consequences, and a sense of self-respect that hadn't existed in months. I needed to act, and I needed to start with myself. The first step was small, almost imperceptible. I began with reflection, writing down my thoughts, recording incidents, analyzing patterns. I noted the repeated dismissals, the calculated words meant to provoke, the moments when my authority had been undermined. At first, it felt obsessive, almost paranoid. But the more I wrote, the clearer it became. I wasn't imagining it. The disrespect, the erosion, the imbalance, it was real. And recognizing it was the first step toward reclaiming control. Next came conversations with myself, the kind of internal dialogue that can be uncomfortable but enlightening. I asked myself, what am I willing to accept? What lines cannot be crossed? What do I need to feel respected, heard, and valued? The answers were uncomfortable. They forced me to confront the ways I had failed myself, the ways I had enabled behaviors that were destructive, and the ways I had neglected my own dignity for the sake of harmony. And then, slowly, the idea of boundaries began to form. Not harsh, not punitive, but firm, necessary, non-negotiable. I started thinking about money, not in a controlling or selfish way, but as a tool for maintaining structure, responsibility, and respect. I realized that financial independence could serve as a foundation for authority and dignity. If respect had been ignored in words, perhaps it could be reinforced in structure. I began taking small, deliberate steps. I reviewed our accounts, our shared finances, and identified areas where oversight was lax, where assumptions had been made, where access had been unrestricted. It wasn't about punishment. It was about creating a framework where responsibility and accountability were clear, where respect wasn't optional, where my role as a father, husband, and provider was acknowledged, not dismissed. This process wasn't easy. It required courage, honesty, and self-reflection. I had to confront uncomfortable truths about my own behavior, about the ways I had enabled defiance, about the moments I had stayed silent when I should have spoken up. I had to admit that I had tolerated disrespect, and that tolerance had consequences. As I began implementing these boundaries, I noticed subtle changes. I felt a sense of empowerment, a quiet confidence that had been missing for months. I wasn't acting out of anger. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was reclaiming my dignity, asserting my role, and establishing a foundation that could support love, respect, and order. The first time I confronted Emma directly about her behavior, it was not a shouting match. It was calm, deliberate, and firm. I reminded her of the values we had always tried to uphold in our family: respect, honesty, and consideration for others. I explained that her words and actions had consequences, not as punishment, but as a reflection of the importance of mutual respect. I could see the surprise in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to speak with such clarity, such quiet authority. I also began to notice how these steps affected the rest of the family. Linda, my wife, seemed relieved. She no longer had to act as a buffer in every minor argument. The younger children began to sense a shift in energy, a calmer, firmer presence in the house. Even Emma, resistant as she was, began to adjust, realizing that some lines were no longer negotiable. This twist, this realization, was more than a single act. It was a process, a journey from helplessness to awareness, from frustration to empowerment. It taught me that respect cannot be assumed, that love without boundaries is fragile, and that patience, while important, must be balanced with assertiveness. I also began reflecting on my own self-worth, independent of the family dynamic. I realized that I had allowed my identity to be tied entirely to my role as a father and provider, neglecting my own needs, desires, and dignity. This recognition was painful but necessary. I began reclaiming small aspects of myself: hobbies, personal time, thoughtful reflection. These acts of self-respect were subtle, but they reinforced the larger changes I was making in my household. I remember the first evening I felt truly hopeful after months of emotional turmoil. The children were in bed. Linda and I sat together in the living room, the quiet hum of the house around us. I reflected on the steps I had taken, the boundaries I had established, and the clarity I had gained. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control, not in a dominating way, but in a grounded, deliberate, respectful way. I had reclaimed a part of myself that I had lost, and in doing so, I had set the stage for healthier dynamics in my family. The realization, though, was not complete without understanding that the journey was ongoing. Change does not occur overnight. Behavior that has been tolerated for years cannot be corrected in a single conversation. Patience, consistency, and reinforcement are essential. I understood that this was not a one-time act, but a sustained effort, a commitment to assertiveness balanced with empathy, discipline balanced with love. And so, I began the process of transformation, not just in the household, but in myself. I became more deliberate in my words, more confident in my presence, more consistent in my expectations. I learned to listen, not just to respond, but to understand. I learned to act firmly, not out of anger, but out of necessity. And most importantly, I learned to value myself, my role, and my dignity, independent of the approval or defiance of others. This was the twist, the turning point, the moment when despair transformed into action. It was the recognition that while I could not control every behavior, I could control my response. I could enforce boundaries. I could demand respect. And I could reclaim the part of myself that had been lost in silence, compromise, and emotional fatigue. In the weeks that followed, subtle shifts began to occur. Emma tested limits, as expected, but met a firm, consistent response. The household atmosphere gradually stabilized. The younger children sensed the change and responded with increased respect and cooperation. Linda seemed lighter, freer, relieved that I was no longer silently carrying the weight of unresolved tension. Most importantly, I felt a renewed sense of self. I realized that the journey from conflict to realization was painful, but necessary. It was a lesson in patience, courage, self-respect, and the balance between love and authority. I understood that true change begins within oneself, and that by asserting boundaries and maintaining dignity, it is possible to transform even the most strained relationships. The twist was not dramatic fireworks or sudden confrontation. It was quiet, deliberate, introspective. It was the acknowledgement that change begins with clarity, action, and the courage to stand firm. It was the understanding that love alone, without boundaries and respect, cannot sustain a family. And it was the first step toward healing, toward rebuilding, and toward reclaiming the dignity that had been slowly eroded over years of compromise. I think the hardest part about change isn't the realization. It's the action. Because once you see the truth, once the clarity strikes like sunlight through a fogged window, you can no longer pretend. You can no longer stay silent. And that's exactly where I found myself, forced to act, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. The first step was simple, but it took every ounce of courage I had. I had to reclaim control over what I had neglected, our finances. For years, I had allowed shared accounts, unrestricted access, and easy routines. I thought this would build trust, but in reality, it had become a vulnerability. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about establishing boundaries, about reinforcing that respect and responsibility are inseparable. I spent the next few nights quietly reviewing every account, every expense, every recurring bill. I made a list of what needed to change. I changed passwords, set clear limits, and created a separate account for discretionary spending, money that only I controlled. I felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt, because I wondered if this would feel controlling to my family. Relief, because it gave me a sense of agency I hadn't felt in months. When I first approached Linda about it, she looked at me with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked. I nodded slowly, choosing my words with care. "I am. Not to punish, not to hurt anyone, but to create a framework where respect and responsibility are clear. We can't keep floating on hope that things will improve. Boundaries are necessary for all of us." She hesitated, then nodded. I think she sensed the calm determination behind my words, the quiet authority that had been absent for so long. She didn't ask further questions. She didn't resist. She simply trusted me, and that trust was both humbling and empowering. The changes didn't happen overnight. Emma noticed almost immediately. The first time she tried to access funds without asking, I calmly reminded her that the account was no longer accessible and explained why. She was surprised. More than that, she was caught off guard. She had expected resistance to be met with either anger or passive tolerance. Neither came. I simply explained the boundary and held it firmly. The initial reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible. Emma tested limits, of course. She argued, questioned, and sometimes even rolled her eyes. But each time, I responded consistently, calmly, without anger. Boundaries, I realized, only work when they are reinforced steadily. If I gave in even once, the structure would crumble. The younger children, in contrast, responded with quiet relief. Alex and Lily noticed that the household had a clearer sense of order. They felt the stability that comes from consistency. Even Ben, the youngest, seemed less anxious, sensing that the invisible tension in the house had eased slightly. It was a small victory, but significant. I also began implementing boundaries in everyday interactions. I was deliberate about my words, my tone, and my expectations. I no longer avoided confrontation. I no longer swallowed frustration to maintain a false peace. I learned to assert myself calmly, clearly, and respectfully. And as I did, I noticed a shift, not just in the way my children responded, but in how I felt about myself. It was empowering to speak with clarity, to express expectations without fear, and to enforce boundaries without anger. For the first time in months, I felt like the father I had always wanted to be, the one who is firm yet loving, patient yet assertive, calm yet present. One evening, a few weeks into these changes, I had a quiet conversation with Emma. She was sitting in her room, scrolling on her phone. I knocked gently and entered, sitting beside her on the bed. "Emma," I said softly, "I want to talk to you. I know things have been tense between us, and I want you to understand why I've made some changes." She looked at me cautiously. I continued, "I'm not trying to control you, and I'm not punishing you. I'm trying to create a home where respect is clear, where everyone understands their responsibilities, and where love isn't confused with permission to disregard rules." She was silent for a moment, then whispered, I didn't realize you felt so frustrated." I nodded. "I have been, and I've realized that I let too much slide for too long. I was trying to keep peace, but I lost sight of boundaries. And boundaries aren't the enemy. They're the foundation for love and respect." Her eyes softened, and for the first time in months, I felt a small bridge reconnecting between us. It was tentative, fragile, and uneven, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, the effects of the changes became more apparent. Family dinners were calmer, conversations more measured. The arguments with Emma still occurred, but they were shorter, more focused, and ultimately resolved with mutual understanding. I felt my role as a father returning, not through fear or control, but through clear, consistent authority balanced with empathy. The financial boundaries also brought unexpected benefits. Linda began noticing how much smoother household management had become. Bills were easier to track, responsibilities clearer, and tensions around money reduced. It wasn't about restriction, it was about structure. And structure, I realized, is the backbone of respect. I also noticed a personal transformation. With boundaries in place, I felt more confident, more capable, and more at peace. The emotional weight I had carried for months began to lift. I slept better, interacted more positively, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. I could finally see that reclaiming control wasn't about dominance. It was about balance, respect, and self-care. There were challenges, of course. Emma tested limits repeatedly, and some days, the frustration returned in waves. But each time, I remembered the clarity of my realization. I responded calmly, firmly, and consistently. I reminded myself that change takes time, that respect cannot be demanded in anger, and that the foundation I was building was stronger than temporary resistance. The younger children thrived in the new environment. They understood the rules more clearly and respected the boundaries set for them. They saw the consistency in my actions, and they began to mirror it in their interactions with each other. Even Linda, who had borne the brunt of tension and mediation for years, seemed lighter, freer, more connected to the household we had rebuilt together. The cumulative effect of these actions was profound. The house felt different, not louder, not more disciplined, not colder, but calmer, clearer, and more connected. I felt a renewed sense of agency, a quiet confidence in my role, and a deep understanding that the changes I implemented were rooted in love, not control. And the most important shift was internal. I realized that empowerment is not about imposing authority, but about reclaiming your sense of self. It's about standing firm in your values, protecting your dignity, and acting with integrity. By establishing boundaries, asserting expectations, and taking responsibility for my own emotional and financial space, I was able to rebuild not just my authority, but my sense of self-worth and balance within the family. This realization, this transformation, was gradual, patient, and deliberate. It required reflection, courage, and consistency. But the reward was more than I had imagined. It wasn't about winning arguments or controlling behavior. It was about restoring respect, rebuilding relationships, and reclaiming the love and harmony that had been strained by neglect, silence, and miscommunication. In the quiet moments, when the house was calm and the children asleep, I reflected on the journey. I thought about the long nights of isolation, the moments of despair, and the emotional fall that had brought me to this point. And I realized that the pain had not been wasted. It had been a teacher, a guide, and a catalyst for change. By taking action, asserting boundaries, and reclaiming control, I was able to transform the household dynamics, restore respect, and rebuild the emotional connections that had been frayed. I understood that the journey wasn't over, that challenges would continue, and that patience, consistency, and empathy would remain essential. But I also knew that I had taken the first critical steps toward lasting change, a foundation built on clarity, respect, and love. The first thing I realized after taking control and setting boundaries was that change wasn't just about rules or money or authority. It was about understanding, patience, and communication. The shift in our household dynamics didn't come from fear or punishment. It came from clarity, consistency, and empathy. Emma didn't transform overnight, of course. She still tested limits, still expressed frustration, but her tone and approach changed subtly. I noticed it in small gestures, a quieter response when reminded of a rule, a brief nod acknowledging my presence, or even a thoughtful question about how to handle a situation responsibly. These small signs weren't dramatic, but they were significant. They were the first hints of respect slowly returning. I remember one evening in particular. We had just finished dinner, and the younger kids had gone off to play. Emma lingered, unusually quiet. She approached me and said softly, "Dad, I know I've been difficult. I didn't mean to hurt you." I looked at her, my chest tight with emotion. It was the first real acknowledgement I had received in months. I smiled gently, feeling a wave of relief and love. "Thank you, Emma. That means a lot. I know it hasn't been easy for you either." We talked that night, not about rules or punishment, but about understanding, expectations, and respect. I shared my feelings, my frustrations, my fears, my love. And she listened. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly heard and understood by my daughter. That night, I realized that healing begins with openness and honesty. Linda also played a crucial role in this phase. With boundaries clearly established, she could step back from constant mediation. We spent more evenings together, talking quietly about our day, sharing thoughts, and reconnecting in ways that had been lost under the weight of tension. I noticed the small gestures, her hand brushing mine, a smile shared over a quiet joke, or even just her presence beside me on the couch. The marriage I thought had been strained beyond repair began to feel whole again, slowly and gently. The younger children, Alex, Lily, and Ben, began to respond to the newfound stability. Rules were clearer, expectations consistent, and the household atmosphere calmer. I saw them emulating respectful behavior with one another, showing patience, and even checking in with me about their feelings. It was a reminder that children notice more than we often give them credit for, and that consistency and empathy are far more effective than anger or frustration. Financial boundaries, initially a source of tension, became a tool for teaching responsibility and accountability. I involved the older kids in discussions about budgeting, saving, and planning. I explained why certain limits were in place and how respect and responsibility were connected to trust. Slowly, they began to understand that structure wasn't a restriction, it was a form of care. Over time, the household began to feel lighter. Arguments still occurred, as they always will in any family, but they were shorter, more focused, and resolved with dialogue rather than confrontation. Emma's respect and consideration grew gradually, and I felt a renewed connection to her, a bond strengthened not by avoidance, but by understanding and boundaries. Through this process, I learned profound lessons about love, respect, and family dynamics. First, I realized that love alone is not enough. Love must be balanced with boundaries, consistency, and clear expectations. Without these, respect can erode, and relationships can become strained. Second, I understood the importance of self-respect. In trying to maintain peace, I had neglected my own dignity. allowing frustration and resentment to build silently. True care for others requires that we also care for ourselves, that we maintain our integrity and assert our needs in a calm, firm, and respectful manner. Third, I discovered the power of consistency. Boundaries, rules, and expectations are only effective if they are enforced steadily. Inconsistency creates confusion, frustration, and conflict. Consistent, calm action, however, fosters trust, respect, and stability. Finally, I learned that communication is key. Open, honest, and empathetic dialogue bridges gaps that silence and avoidance cannot. Sharing feelings, fears, and expectations, without anger or blame, creates understanding and fosters connection, even in the midst of conflict. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the weight of previous failures seemed too heavy, when Emma's defiance felt insurmountable. But through patience, reflection, and deliberate action, those moments gave way to clarity, empowerment, and gradual healing. I remember one quiet afternoon when all 4 children were in the living room, laughing together while I read nearby. I looked around at the scene and felt a surge of gratitude. The house was calm, respectful, and connected. Emma was teasing Lily gently rather than arguing. Ben was building something with Alex, sharing ideas and cooperating. And I realized that the struggle, the pain, and the isolation had led to something deeper, a renewed sense of connection, a family capable of love, respect, and understanding. I also reflected on myself, on my growth throughout this journey. I had learned to balance patience with assertiveness, empathy with boundaries, and love with respect. I had reclaimed my role as a father, husband, and provider, not through dominance, but through clarity, consistency, and quiet strength. In the evenings, I would sit quietly, reflecting on the journey. I thought about the Thanksgiving moment, the words that had cut so deeply, and the months of struggle that followed. I realized that the pain had been a catalyst for change, a necessary spark that forced me to confront reality, take action, and reclaim dignity. By the time the holidays arrived again, the atmosphere in the house was noticeably different. I watched as the children interacted respectfully, as Emma engaged in conversations with consideration, and as Linda and I shared quiet moments of understanding. The tension that had once dominated our lives had lifted, replaced by connection, empathy, and mutual respect. The greatest lesson I learned, and one I hope others can take to heart, is this: families are not defined by perfection, absence of conflict, or blind obedience. Families are defined by love, respect, communication, and the courage to confront challenges with patience, empathy, and integrity. Conflict is inevitable, mistakes are unavoidable, and struggles will come. But how we respond, to set boundaries, assert respect, and communicate openly, determines whether the bonds endure or fracture. I also learned that empowerment does not come from control over others, but from self-respect, clarity, and deliberate action. By reclaiming my emotional and financial boundaries, I was able to restore respect, rebuild connections, and foster a healthier environment for everyone in the household. And finally, I understood the quiet, enduring power of reflection. The months of isolation, despair, and introspection were not wasted. They were preparation, guidance, and insight. They taught me that the greatest growth often comes from the hardest experiences, and that patience, courage, and self-awareness can transform even the most challenging family dynamics. As I sit here now, looking at my children playing together, my wife beside me, and the warmth of our home surrounding us, I feel a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, for the resilience of my family, and for the opportunity to rebuild relationships on a foundation of respect, understanding, and love. I know challenges will continue, as they always do in life. There will be arguments, mistakes, and moments of frustration, but I am no longer afraid of them. I am confident in my ability to act with integrity, assert boundaries, and foster a household built on respect and love. The journey from heartbreak to healing is not quick, nor is it easy, but it is worth every moment of struggle, every tear, every reflection. Because in the end, we are not defined by the conflicts we face, but by how we respond, by the courage we summon, the love we maintain, and the respect we uphold for ourselves and for one another. And so, the story of that Thanksgiving, the words that cut so deeply, the months of struggle, the isolation, the realization, and the action becomes not a tale of despair, but of growth, healing, and hope. It is a reminder that love, patience, and courage, when balanced with boundaries, respect, and reflection, can transform even the most fractured relationships into something enduring, meaningful, and true.